Good morning, everyone. Okay. Good morning, everyone. The internet's global. Even with all of its problems, in 2022, it still represents a channel for people all over the world to speak directly to each other, and for people to challenge human rights violations, authoritarian policies, even mass killings. Internet policy could reflect that global promise, but instead, it is largely colonial. Internet laws and policies created in the EU are having an incidental and largely negative global impact. EU policymakers are also participating in global forums that set policy far away from impacted communities. Authoritarian leaders and governments have copied the worst parts of laws, like Germany's NetzDG, while passing their own restrictive internet-related laws. Meanwhile, platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter are making decisions about tools and policies that have nearly as much impact on the free expression and other human rights of users around the world as government policy, without real accountability. All of this is immediately apparent in the Arabic-speaking world, where my panelists are all coming from. Platforms work to comply with EU policies like the terrorist content online regulation through the use of automation. As a result, human rights documentation is removed. They dedicate resources to content moderation in the EU that the Arabic-speaking world lacks, leaving up harmful hate speech and misinformation in the region while still removing political or human rights content. In this panel, our three experts, Marwa Fatofta, Mohammed Najm, Dia Kayali, will provide insight into how content moderation policies are playing out in the Arabic-speaking world and how EU advocacy can consider these impacts. They'll talk about current legislative trends in the region and in the EU, global policymaking, and organizing efforts around these issues. Our discussion will delve into the Facebook papers, problems caused by artificial intelligence in platform moderation, as well as fact-checking, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the need for better strategies to understand the different dialects and the particular cultural contexts of the region. The discussion will be solutions-oriented, and we'll have a Q&A at about 45 minutes in. We'll welcome your feedback. So let's get started. I'd like to just start with each of you, maybe starting with Dia, to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work relative to the region.
Great. Good morning. I have to say it's quite weird not having speakers up here. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay. Fantastic. It's also, I just want to say, really wonderful to be in person, to see all of your faces. I am Berlin-based, and I work for Mnemonic, which is a German-registered nonprofit. We're the parent organization for Syrian Archive, Yemeni Archive, and Sudanese Archive. We've also recently started a Ukrainian Archive and are archiving content from Belarus as well. Syrian Archive was started around 2014, and it is a Syrian created organization. It was started with the purpose, as you would imagine, of collecting and verifying documentation of human rights abuses from Syria. It's expanded because there is, unfortunately, such a need for this work. And as you all probably know, there is an increasing amount of human rights documentation that is found on social media platforms. The reason that we got into policy advocacy is because we discovered that the policy of platforms has a lot to do with what content is left up, what content is taken down, and the collections that we ourselves are archiving. We're able to measure to a certain extent how much content is removed by comparing our archives, the things that we've taken and we've put into our own archives, and comparing them to the URLs of that content to see what is still online. And we've discovered that we can actually see spikes in removal based on policy discussions. We have a really unique opportunity as a German organization because we can do what I've increasingly been calling diaspora organizing. What I mean by that is that here we are based in the EU, and we hear from people that we work with in Syria, in Sudan, in Yemen, and really in the rest of the Arabic-speaking world as well. We hear things like, my content got taken down. I'm not sure why. I got a notice, depending on the platform. Unfortunately, oftentimes these notices aren't so clear, but I got a notice that my content was removed as graphic content, violent content, terrorist or violent extremist content. And, they're not always clear why. We're also often not clear why. There's not enough transparency, of course, and this is something that we would welcome questions on. But we do see that when platforms started using, in particular, machine learning to detect what they determine to be terrorist or violent extremist content, these definitions themselves are very much dependent on Western ideas of what is terrorism, what is violent extremism. And platforms are often encouraged to use more machine learning by regulation. So we're going to get into some conversation specifically about EU legislation, as it says in the description. One thing that I'll just note now, and then I'm going to pass it on to my fellow panelists, is that just 2 days ago, the European Terrorist Content Online Regulation and Upload Filters started going into force. And I am very worried to see what's going to happen to collections of human rights documentation that have already been under attack. I think this is going to create even more removal of content. So that's why we do policy advocacy. That's sort of how we do policy advocacy, being based here in the EU. Also do a lot of work directly with companies. And I'm just so excited to be here today and be able to talk to all of you and hopefully plant some seeds in your minds about how we can work together more and how these issues can be more of a part of the conversation.
Thank you, Dia. Mohammed, tell us about your work.
Hello. Can you guys also hear me? Okay, perfect. So my name is Mohammed Najm. I'm based in Beirut. I'm one of the co-founders and the executive director of SMEX. SMEX is a digital rights organization. We focus on the Arabic-speaking countries. We focus on issues related to freedom of expression, surveillance recently, data protection, etc. We are here today because we know there is a lot of importance of understanding the European context, and because we need to share that being from the Arab region, and there's like this assumption when you hear about there's like the Arab League, and there's a lot of meetings happening, but all these entities that exist, they have no legal binding. So basically, you have the EU Commission here, you guys have a legal binding when it comes to regulations. When it comes to the Arab region, it's really negotiation between each individual country, basically each authoritarian regime with the tech companies. So that's why it's really important to have the support of European regulation, of European citizens, because 2 things. One, we cannot do policy advocacy with authoritarian regimes because they simply don't care. They put people in jail. We're going to talk about this later. And 2, the only hope that we have is like other regulation will actually restrict these tech companies to support and to protect human rights. And those kind of restriction and support, when it starts applied in the EU countries, it will actually be extended to international countries and other global South countries, including the Arab region. And that's why it's very important to have this and to have your support and to have more pressure coming from EU countries towards tech companies. We are negotiating with tech companies, but guess what? Most of these tech companies are based in Dubai, and soon they're going to be based in Saudi Arabia. And these 2 countries have no protection at all for human rights. There's a lot of activists in jail because they want to work in politics, or they talk about religion, or about LGBT issues, etc., etc. So that's why we really need the support of Europeans to be able to pressure tech companies to respect human rights in the Arab region as much as they do respect it in the European countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Marwa.
Okay, also hearing test. Can you hear me? All right, wonderful. First of all, really happy to be here, and I want to thank Dia for putting this session together and to be among friends and experts who work diligently on content moderation issues. My name is Marwa Fatofta. I'm a Palestinian activist, used to be a Berliner dweller until recently I moved to Hamburg, which is also a cool city. I work as a MENA policy and advocacy manager at Access Now. We are a digital rights organization. Our mission is to defend and extend the rights of users at risk around the world. Over a decade ago, we started, actually the inception of Access Now was a digital security helpline. that was born out of the Iran Revolution in 2009. And so we work very closely with communities on the ground, with activists, human rights defenders, civil society actors. And throughout the years, we're able to document the plethora of challenges and cybersecurity risks, but also restrictions on people's speech online, particularly on social media platforms. And my job comes in by trying to draw patterns of where and how people are being silenced. And Dia and Najim had already alluded to some of those trends. But what I can say, generally speaking, is that there is absolutely discrimination in the way platforms prioritize their resources, the way they develop content moderation policies that are sometimes extremely blind to regional context and nuances, but sometimes actually pretty hostile to local context, which results in silencing people, which results in silencing political dissent in a region where digital authoritarianism is on the rise, where governments are very eager to control and police online spaces, whether by passing draconian cybercrime legislations, we're going to talk about the legislative piece later, or deploying spyware and surveillance technologies. Social media platforms have become a sort of a refuge for people to be able to express their views, whether it be on politics, on religion, on gender identity. All forms of expression, unfortunately, are being targeted as well as a result of those biased content moderation policies. So I'm really happy to be here today to delve deeper into some of those issues and see what the EU can and should stop doing. I think it's important to also point out at the very beginning that the EU is not a passive actor. And I can share more about this later in our discussion. So back to you, Jillian.
Thank you, Marwa. Okay, so we're going to get deeper in a little bit into some of these content moderation questions and specific issues that affect the region. But first, kind of a bit of a lightning round question, which is, what's the number one thing you would want EU civil society or lawmakers to hear? What's the number one thing you want to share with them about how their work impacts the Arabic-speaking world?
Great. So I'll start, and I'm going to cheat and actually say sort of two things. And the first is, you're doing the right thing. You came to this discussion. Whatever you get here, I encourage you to share it out. If you work at an organization, whether you're working in policy, whether you're a hacker, whether you're in government, whatever it is that you do, just share what you've learned here. And so what I'm saying is, just think about us. And then the second, of course, is talk to us. As I mentioned, Berlin, Mnemonic is a Berlin-based organization. There are also many international organizations that have staff in Germany. There are many immigrants here in Berlin from the Arabic-speaking world. And I want to say, of course, a lot of what I'm saying here is about the Arabic-speaking world, but it is relevant for many communities. There are a lot of people who've come specifically, especially to Berlin, to escape authoritarianism, to be in a place where they feel like they can speak more freely. And so that is a huge opportunity for you and for us. So work with us. Talk to us, collaborate with us, help us understand how policymaking in Brussels happen. If you don't understand it, we can talk about it together, because it is something that I'm still learning, even though I've been working with Mnemonic for a while. And devote resources to this conversation. We've seen that something that I've been a part of with alongside Access Now is the DSA Human Rights Alliance. So this is something where Electronic Frontier Foundation and Access have better understanding of what is happening in Brussels. They have better understanding of policy making. A lot of times, as you probably know, our understanding of legislation as it's developing is based on inside rumors and conversations that a lot of people don't have access to. And so working as part of an alliance, we've been able to participate more in that discussion, both to comment on the impact of the legislation here in the EU, but also to bring that global perspective. And it may seem daunting. I know for myself that trying to talk to members of parliament, trying to talk to members of the European Commission, it's hard sometimes even as a European organization focused on European citizens, but it's something that the conversation needs, and it will not change unless we make it change, unless we bring up these issues and we say that they're important, that when you're passing this legislation, when you're having these discussions, when you're having confusing trilogue negotiations, that you need to think about the impact on the rest of the world. So I do think it's something that's changing, and everybody in this room today is part of that. So thank you.
Oh, all right. Off to a great start. Mohammed.
Yes, that's great, Dia. So I want to try to complement some of the points that Dia mentioned. I mean, basically, you are very well established being in Europe because, one, most of you live in democratic states, whether you know it or not. To some extent, you can actually talk to your deputies, talk to the parliament. You can actually change policies on individual level or groups. So definitely the idea of alliance is really important among us coming from the Arab region and Europe. This is really important. But two, I want to start from this like basic point on how tech companies understand things. The two biggest markets are the US and Europe. So you have control over how you can control this market. And that's why when Europe are pushing policies, these tech companies are forced to abide by these laws and policies. And I can give you one example that to some extent is actually working to our benefit in the region. There's something called Google data center that's happening in Saudi Arabia. And they claim, Google claimed that they did some human rights due diligence, which is very sarcastic for us. How can you human rights due diligence in a country like Saudi Arabia? We'll leave this sarcasm for later. But like, we look at this in details and we saw that Aramco, which is one of the biggest state-owned company, is the one that's partnering with Google. And now Saudi Arabia is pushing a new data protection law. Unfortunately for them, there is nothing to lay the ground on this data protection law. They have no constitution in Saudi Arabia yet. There's no framework to actually build a data protection law on anything in the country. So they drafted this nice design law. If you look at it, you'll see like, wow, they're trying to look at the GDPR. But if you go deeply in the law, because our policy team has analyzed this, and we've seen all these gaps because they don't really understand the core of the data protection. But they tried because they know that there is something called GDPR. They failed miserably because there's nothing they can stand on to do that. So that's why European laws are very important, because they are pushing things forward. We hope this specific relationship would fail, because recently we just received an email because this kind of policy, we took it to the next level with some of us, SMEX and Access Now and many others, where there was voting of shareholders about Google data center, if it will apply inside Saudi Arabia or not. And majority of the vote came against this project, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, the two biggest votes, Larry Page and Eric Schmidt, they voted to support this project. So we're now in this process. But just to tell you how everything was really established about having a GDPR, that it's clear that it's data protective, and that's been applied on the global level, including the MENA region. Those kind of laws are the ones that we want to see, and those kind of laws, they frame the cases as human rights protective as possible.
Thank you. These are excellent points as well. Marwa, what about you? What would you want to tell EU lawmakers?
Well, before I tell EU lawmakers anything, I think for our audience, maybe we could just set the scene about what are the problems of content moderation in the Arabic-speaking world. So you know what we're dealing with, and probably you know how you can help us. If I were to describe what's the main problem with content moderation, which I know many people are complaining about and many governments around the world are trying to figure out how to regulate big tech that have an extremely outsized power over our societies, over our politics, and almost every aspect of our life. Now, in the Arab-speaking world, somehow, unfortunately, we have the worst of all worlds when it comes to content moderation. We have over-enforcement on the one hand when it comes to issues related to moderating terrorist content or incitement to violence. And as Dia mentioned, there are, of course, many question marks and red lines under these words of terrorism and incitement to violence. Who gets to define terrorism? Who gets to define incitement to violence? If you look at Meta's dangerous individuals and organizations list that bans those individuals and orgs because they are terrorists, they often follow the US designated lists or terrorist lists. Meta keeps this list private to itself, but thanks to someone who decided to leak it to journalists, the majority of people who are on this list come from the MENA region. Now, when companies enforce these kind of policies using AI, but even sometimes using human reviewers, the effect is that political speech, political dissent, citizen journalism, documentation of human rights abuses, documentation of war crimes, especially in a region that is marred by political turmoil and active armed conflicts in at least 4 countries, all of that content is being erroneously removed. Without transparency, people often don't know why their content is removed. They're not informed. They can't appeal those decisions. Now, on the other side, we have a problem of lack of enforcement or under-enforcement. Smear campaigns that are state-sanctioned, targeting women activists, queer activists, LGBTQ and other gender minorities. Disinformation is really rampant on those platforms. And even though when they have specific policies that ban certain content, for instance, Meta has a policy that bans content around, help me out, therapies for homosexuals to convert.
Conversion therapy.
Conversion therapies, thank you. There are people in the Arab world with millions of followers, like doctors, therapists with millions of followers, verified pages that do exactly that. But why are these companies not paying attention? Simply because they don't care. I mean, that's the easy answer, right? But they're not allocating the right resources to moderate properly. So we have over-enforcement on the one hand, under-enforcement on the other hand. And where does the EU come in? As I said, the EU is not a passive actor. There's definitely a need for them to, when we think about regulating big tech, there's, in the MENA region, as Najm mentioned, there is no legislative processes. Civil society don't really have the space to contribute or to inform laws that are right-respecting. So there comes the legislation piece and the fact that you can somehow influence those policies to ensure that people's rights are respected around the world. But I want to mention something important here. The EU has been funding and training security agencies around the world, and particularly in the MENA region, under the pretext of fighting terrorism and illegal migration. Many of those training programs and funding programs are done without any due diligence, human rights impact assessments, or data protection impact assessments. For example, the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Training, CEPOL, they've trained the Algerian police forces in April 2019 on how to use open intelligence resources, how to create fake profiles on social media, how to create socket puppets, how in order to fight terrorism. Around that period, there was a revolution in Algeria that took down the president, Bouteflika, after 20 years. And there was a massive amount of disinformation campaign coming from these fake accounts. Now, of course, we can't make a direct and explicit link between the training and the fake accounts. Yet, we have to ask the question why the EU is doing these kind of trainings in countries that are known for their authoritarianism, where users can't appeal, users can't seek redress. So there's definitely a piece here. I mean, Access Now, together with Privacy International and a number of other civil society organizations, filed a complaint to the EU Ombudsman to investigate why the EU is doing exactly the opposite, actually violating their own laws that they apply here on this continent. But when they go to countries like Algeria, Tunisia, Jordan, Lebanon, just to name a few, all of those safeguards are thrown out of the bin because, hey, we need to stop illegal migration and we need to fight terrorism.
Thank you, Marwa. And thank you for painting a picture of the content moderation issues, which we're going to dig a little bit deeper into now. I'm going to ask each of you to give us some specifics. I'm going to call on each of you with something that I know that you know about. So just for the audience's sake, you saw the Facebook papers last year. Frances Haugen leaked a set of documents, many of which have not yet fully been released, and many of which cover the region. So these panelists have been focusing on this topic for much longer than really anyone that I know. So Dia, I'm going to call on you first to talk more specifically about some of the issues related to human rights documentation and terrorist and extremist content. Tell us what that looks like. What is the picture right now with regards to content moderation?
Yeah, so it's not a pretty picture. As I mentioned, the upload filters in the terrorist content online regulation have just gone into effect. We will certainly be looking at our own collections and seeing if there's an impact on our collections. Unfortunately, it's oftentimes hard to say exactly why something is taken down, and it gets harder and harder as more machine learning is implemented. European regulations are very much encouraging the use of machine learning. They are very much encouraging the use of any technology that is going to help companies take down content as quickly as possible. We hear more and more, not just in the EU, this is a global trend of trying to get down what is considered harmful content, sarcastic quotation marks, harmful content as quickly as possible. So the terrorist content online regulation, unaccountable requests from various agencies where things are not going through the entire judicial process. So different agencies can make requests. There's also some of this in the DSA. As I mentioned, there are potentially positive impacts of the DSA, and we can get into that, particularly things like due diligence. Hopefully this is going to be helpful. But at the same time, we are seeing this push to just take down content based on, in particular, lists that include a lot of groups from the region. So we see things like content that has unfortunately even mentions Hezbollah or mentions Hamas, even if it's something negative, even if it's a critique, that content will get taken down, particularly if it is in Arabic, particularly if it is posted by a user that has the language set to Arabic. And this is a particular problem where we know that machine learning is very bad at dealing with Arabic. Jillian mentioned the Facebook papers, and they have not been made entirely public. I have had the privilege to look at some of that documentation and looked at it, particularly what it says around Arabic-speaking language, Arabic-speaking regions and Arabic content. And, we keep saying Arabic and Arab, but the fact is that Arabic is many languages. If you've seen, even in Berlin, there are Sudanese people who are having a conversation with Lebanese people. They're not always going to understand every word, every phrase. And yet companies think that they can use moderators that are based in Morocco who are speaking Moroccan Arabic to moderate content from Sudan, to moderate content from Yemen. And so we have a real problem where those moderators are making decisions based on dialects that they don't completely understand. But even worse, the papers go into great detail about how those moderators are actually labeling the training data. So the problem becomes exponential. You're creating a framework that is completely broken, and then that framework is going to be applied increasingly because European regulation is saying, get this bad content down very quickly. And that bad content is not far-right violence, which we know is a problem here. It's a problem globally. We had Hala, we've had many other live-streamed attacks since then, including Buffalo. And this is not the focus of these regulations. This is not the focus of EU lawmakers. The focus is what they consider, what they call Islamist terrorism, right? So it becomes a real problem for human rights documentation. And the irony is that Europe has a lot of countries that have universal jurisdiction. And Germany, of course, had the first prosecution of a member of the Assad regime, which is, something that every German should be proud of. It's incredible. There are few opportunities like this to actually prosecute members of the regime, not just for terrorism-related crimes, but actually for crimes against humanity. So European prosecutors actually need this content as well. And because there's quite a broken process of getting evidence from the US and from US-based companies, sometimes EU prosecutors and different justice agencies will come to Mnemonic to try to get content. That's great. We're happy we're able to provide it for them. But if, for example, they once knew that there was a video there and now it's been taken down because of EU regulation, it's actually shooting the chance for justice in the foot. I mean, it's a real problem. And it's just such a shame to see that content get taken down. One other trend that I want to just briefly mention, of course, is the attack on end-to-end encryption, particularly in the name of, protecting children. Now, I want to protect children, and I think that child sexual abuse material is a huge problem. Of course it is. And we know that it's a problem, particularly, we've heard some very disturbing stories here in Berlin about the proliferation of that material. But destroying end-to-end encryption is not the way to go. And there are many German politicians that have stood up and said, we really support privacy. We support end-to-end encryption. But it hasn't fully filtered up to the EU level. So this is something where I think there's a great chance for civil society to really encourage and support protecting end-to-end encryption because human rights defenders rely on it. We talk to a lot of people over Signal, and I would not want to see a backdoor built into Signal in the name of protecting people when that's actually not even the main place where people are sharing things. They're not sharing child sexual abuse material on encrypted messaging platforms. In fact, that content gets kept in Dropbox still to this point. So that's really not the way to go to address this problem. And it's such a disturbing problem that, we want to take any action we can to correct it, but we should take action that actually helps. And destroying end-to-end encryption is not the right way to go. So again, I think for the most part, Germany is on the right side of this issue, but not entirely. And I hope that bringing the global perspective and saying we can be a leader here and we can make things better and safer for human rights defenders, including the people who come to Germany, who come to Berlin as refugees to be safe. I think that's something that there's both positive and negative trends here. I'm going to stop there, even though there's much more I could say.
No, these are excellent points. Thank you so much, Dia. Marwa, I'm going to come to you next to talk specifically about Palestine, where you've just returned from, if I recall. Tell us a little bit about, I know last year, this has been ongoing for many, many years, as some of our audience members will know. But last year in particular, we saw a rise in content takedowns related to documentation of protests, as well as other political speech. Tell us a little bit about that and what's happening now.
Thank you, Jillian. Last year, in May specifically, a number of Palestinian families were threatened to be evicted from their homes in a neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. And for the family, or some members of the family, they went on social media to mobilize Palestinians, but also globally around the world, because those people don't have access to mainstream media. So the way for them to share their plea and to share the fact that they might overnight be thrown on the streets from their home where they were born and raised, and their grandparents were born and raised, Unfortunately, what happened on social media is that content was taken down. If you guys remember, just overnight, almost everybody on Instagram who shared content from that campaign with the hashtag Safe Sheikh Jarrah had their content or their story removed. And Instagram came out and said, apologies, in a very vague statement on Twitter, we're facing technical issues. And upon pushback from us, actually, from people who are on this platform, on the stage, Instagram issued a second statement highlighting specifically that they are indeed facing a technical glitch that resulted in silencing Palestinians, but also indigenous community in Canada. Colombia, when it was going through mass protests and people were out on the street. Now, the story doesn't end here, of course. The restrictions continued, and there were some interesting dynamics there. So it wasn't only just content takedown and account suspensions, but live streaming was stopped on Instagram and interrupted. People's stories were shadow banned. So, for instance, if you posted a story about, I don't know, birds or terrible German weather, then you will get high viewership. But the moment you post about Palestine in the next story, your viewership will massively drop. People were not able to even like or share. So a lot of basic functions of the platforms were completely disabled. Of course, when we raise these issues to the platforms, the same story were repeated again. And it's quite interesting how their entire infrastructure is kind of geared towards silencing people. I mean, for instance, Dia mentioned how artificial intelligence is not able to moderate Arabic content. So when one particular incident, the Israeli forces were invading Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest mosque to 2 billion Muslims around the world, hashtag Al-Aqsa was disabled. So all of the content that contained that one particular word where people were reporting live were disabled for a short while. And according to some press leaks, that's because Meta at the time decided that Al-Aqsa, which is the name of the mosque, is a terrorist organization. You would hope for a big company like this that has better resources. It really doesn't take an expert to distinguish between Al-Aqsa and Al-Aqsa Brigades, which is the military faction of Hamas. Long story short, there is an interesting element to there's an interesting factor why also content was taken down. The Israeli authorities have set up a so-called cyber unit, which is an internet referral unit, which, by the way, this kind of system started here in Europe, in the UK, Belgium, and also Europol, where police departments or law enforcement agencies set up a monitoring unit, really, that monitors social media content and flag it to the platforms as a violation of their own terms of services. So you're basically not saying that this piece of content should be removed because it's illegal, but should be removed because it violates Twitter or Facebook's or whatever's terms of services. Now, companies have made some positive steps in providing some transparency on when they receive requests from governments for content takedown, but those kind of requests don't get covered in transparency reporting. So you don't really see, for instance, if your content has been removed, you're living here in Germany, you're posting about Palestine or anywhere, and the Israeli cyber unit has reported your piece of content, you really wouldn't know if your content was removed as a result of a government request or direct action from the company. So this is where this is a key piece as well. We're looking into of how internet referral units should actually be regulated, and also how companies should ensure that even these kind of voluntary mechanisms and voluntary requests should be captured in those transparency reporting, because I think we have the right to know whether any government is requesting our content to be taken down.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marwa. I'm going to come to Mohammed next, but I want to give my panelists one quick last question before we go to Q&A, just to think about that we'll do after I ask Mohammed this question. So anything that you want to pitch, any site, any article that you've written, any panel that's coming up, think about that. We'll come to that in just a moment. But first, Mohammed, I just want to ask you specifically, you've been, all of our panelists have grown up in or spent ample time in the region, but Mohammed has actually been based there throughout the pandemic, and you've seen, what's going on the ground from governments, and we've also seen, of course, a case that is very important to all of us on this panel, the case of Aleb Fattah, a friend of ours in Egypt who's been in prison for far too long at this point. So can you talk a little bit about that case and really anything else that you would like our audience to hear about what's happening, from states in the region?
Sure. So I want to start from where Marwa stopped about transparency report. I think that was really a good step back then when it all started. But what's really interesting for us, like we look at the transparency report for Germany, the US, we see like hundreds or thousands of cases per year. We look at different Arab states or Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, other countries, Lebanon. There's really very few, 1, 2, 5, 10 per year. That really tells us that the problem that we have is somewhere else in our region. The problem that we have is really in the laws that we have, and really like the local laws that we have. And one of the things that we witnessed within the pandemic, before the pandemic a little bit, is that whenever there's like these kind of international treaties or like some pressure on Morocco or other countries to pass a specific law, they actually do that. But any kind of regulation goes directly to the criminalization of speech, to like we can talk a lot about cybercrime law, spreading of fake news law, misinformation law, anti-terrorism law, like regulating media, access to information, you call it, like all these laws that should be regulating the relationship between individual information and the state goes directly to a place where the citizens are the ones to blame. They go to jail. Like we have journalists in different countries who are in jail for spreading false information. So over-regulation goes directly and always to a place where it's really hurtful for the citizens. It doesn't mean that the regulation that's happening in the EU is the same. So those are two different dynamics. It's just a point that I want to share. And back to Ala, our friend, he's been in jail for so many years because of those kind of laws, because of those kind of regulation that happen in Egypt. He's in jail because he retweeted something. Someone is in jail about injustice case, and Ala retweeted it, and he is now spending a lot of time in jail, 10 years, I think, in jail. And today he's spending his 69th day of, he's not eating, he's on hunger strike. He was in a very inhumane situation. He recently got his British citizenship, so there is a hope to make some pressure on the UK government and the European Union as well to have his right seeing a council. He's not allowed to see a council. The state as well of Egypt are spreading rumors that he's not on hunger strike. So we really need this help on the case. You can look at the hashtag Free Allah, Save Allah. There's also a website under his name, freeallah.net. Any help is much appreciated for someone who is actually innocent, who was one of the leader activists in his own country, who is a very sweet person and a good person, and we all know him on a personal level. And we all know him not last year. We know him since 2008, 2007. So it's been a while. And Allah spent jail in like 4 different regimes in Egypt. He started with Mubarak, then when the army was in power, then when what's his name, the Islamist person, Morsi, and then now Sisi. Like he graduated from 4 different regimes in Egypt, and it's time for him to go out from jail and just live his life. He has a son. He wasn't allowed to have books. He wasn't allowed to read and write just recently, and his family were celebrating that, like basic human rights. They were celebrating that he gave them laundry. That was a celebration for the family. So we really need your support. If you just can go to the website, if you can contact your deputies in Europe or in UK, that will be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. And buy his book. It's called You Have Not Been Defeated, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's available here in English. Here, meaning Germany. Okay, we've only got a few minutes for questions, so I think I'm going to go to that. If you've got anything you want to pitch, say it at the very end, yeah? Cool, thank you. So do we have any questions? It's going to be hard for me to see. Let me get my earplug in. I feel old up here. Here we go. Okay. Do I see any hands? I think the mic will just come to you, yeah? That's how this works.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much to the entire panel. I have a question for Marwa. You mentioned about EU, you give the example of EU training the Algerian forces, and you already raised up the question, why is EU doing that? I was wondering if you could talk more about why EU is training the forces in Algeria. And secondly, about the two examples you gave about Algeria and Instagram. In general, how are these, because we are today talking about colonialism, if you could talk more about how are these two cases related to the issue of what we are increasingly calling digital colonialism? Thanks.
Excellent question.
Yeah, excellent question indeed. So, as I mentioned, the European Union, there are different arms of the European Commission specifically, some that are funding the so-called countries in the south neighborhood of the Mediterranean, which sadly has seen an influx of migrants who've simply die and drown in the Mediterranean Sea because they're seeking better opportunities. For the EU, this is a huge problem. This, together with terrorism and rise of extremism. So their way to tackle this issue is to basically fund authoritarian countries in different parts of the MENA region, and not only in the MENA region, by the way, but also in sub-Saharan Africa and the Balkans, by not only to monitor social media and all of those tactics deployed or training law enforcement in those countries, but also donating biometric surveillance technologies that are, I would say, strictly or severely restricted and regulated here in the EU. And it's, for me, it's quite outstanding how for the EU, it's a bit like outside, out of mind. As long as that, whatever ramifications that will come out of those technologies or these trainings, they happen elsewhere. That's not the EU's problem. The EU's main concern is that we don't want people showing up on our shores, so we can sacrifice freedoms and rights along the way. And that is absolutely wrong, and I think should be rectified. And this is why we are complaining to the EU Ombudsman regarding this, to call on to investigate those different arms of the European Commission. Now, how does this tie to colonialism? I mean, we could take hours to just, I mean, I would think the EU's policies on migration in and of themselves are a legacy of colonialism. But also the way that we are relegated to basically second-class humans, where our rights are not important, are less important than Europe's foreign policy interests or interests in, again, like keeping migration at bay. I think these are all different manifestations of colonialism and colonial legacies. Now, when it comes to social media specifically, I have a particular opinion that for those companies, they develop policies that are not only devoid of local contexts, but they are demonizing local context. I mean, as I said, I'm Palestinian. I come from a country that has been under occupation for decades. We have a lexicon, we have a political lexicon, we have ways we can express ourselves. Some of those words, according to Facebook, are praise of terrorism, and I beg to differ. Who gets to decide that a certain word or a certain expression, according to someone sitting in the Silicon Valley, likely a white dude, that this is a praise of terrorism? It's an erosion of my own expression, it's an erosion of my own identity. I should not be worried as a Palestinian user on Facebook or Instagram or any of those social media companies to express myself and to be proud of my heritage, to be able to share my narrative as freely as I can without being, always pointed at that I'm supporting terrorism. I'm not supporting terrorism and I'm not a terrorist. So, but then again, this speaks to who sets the parameters, who gives the permission to narrate. That's another important point. A lot of us in the so-called global South don't have that permission because someone in the US or here in Europe decides otherwise.
Thank you, Marwa. So I think we have time for one more question, maybe two, if we keep it brief. Let's see.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for this panel. My question is brief. So in witnessing and observing all of these incoherent content moderation policies in the region and digital colonialism, what mechanisms do you suggest to tackle the issues? And do you think addressing existing relationships between big tech companies and local governments could possibly lead a way forward? Thank you.
Ooh. Who would like to take that one? Very, very pointed question.
Sure. I mean, I'll start by sort of repeating. I don't want to listen to myself. I'll start by repeating what I said earlier, which is really solidarity, and solidarity that is aware of positionality and aware of who has the right to speak, who is privileged to speak and to have their rights protected in the EU and on these platforms, and to really think about how you can use your own position. And something I should mention is that I'm Syrian American. I have a U.S. passport. That means that I was very easily able several years ago to travel to the Palestinian Digital Activism Forum. If I had a Syrian passport, I wouldn't even be here, probably. It would have been a completely different situation. So thinking about how you can use your own position, the funding that your organization may have. Syrian organizations were almost completely unable to get funding because of sanctions against Syria, which is ridiculous that you wouldn't fund the people who might try to push against the regime, but instead we end up getting harmed. So solidarity, but solidarity that is not colonial, saying, I'm going to help the poor people who don't have EU citizenship. That's not what we're asking for on this panel. And I want to be really clear. We're not asking for that. We're asking for you to work with us. Nothing for us without us. So work with us and we can think through these policies. We can have things like the DSA Human Rights Alliance where we are being specific. We understand the policy. We understand the process, and we are being active to address it. In response to the second part of your question, can we think about the relationships between these companies and local governments? Absolutely. I think this should be more of a discussion. I'm not sure what the policy solutions to that are, although there's definitely an issue of more and more countries passing laws that require a local representative. And unfortunately, I think that is also something that there's a desire for that in the EU, for companies to be directly responsive to EU law and EU policy. And I understand that, but to have offices here, this is something that we have to think about. So think about if a law is copied outside of the EU context, what will that look like? And I encourage everybody to read the Digital Berlin Wall report, which came out a few years ago, and it talks about all the copycat legislation of NetzDG. There's been 13 copycat laws. Only 3 of them are in countries that are rated as free. And many of the countries that passed those laws specifically said, well, we can do it because this is a law from Germany, and Germany is a democratic country. But unfortunately, we also know that they have specifically used those laws to silence speech. So think about the negative externalities, work in solidarity, think about your own position, and talk to us so that we can really be effective.
Thank you, Dia. And Mohammed, is there anything? Yes. No? Okay.
Thank you.
I think we are getting close to the end. We can probably take one more question, but before we do, I would just really like to say thank you again to all 3 of these panelists, Dia Kayali, Mohammed Najm, Marwa Fatofta. They'll be around today. I think you can find them, ask them more questions. Is there one last question for our panelists? Maybe a lightning round kind of question.
Yeah.
Great.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for the talk so far. In this panel, I've heard a lot that EU and its citizens should pressure regimes into changing their digital policies and their relationship with tech companies. But I can imagine, and I've seen regimes do that, trying to fend off these initiatives by framing them as interference with the domestic affairs of a sovereign country. And so the question to you would be, do you think that narrative is like relevant addressing, and what would your response be to that defense that I can imagine?
Yeah, so I want to clarify something, which is actually we want you to pressure EU politicians, your governments. Think about the laws that are being passed here. Now, certainly there's more to do. I mean, we talked about Allah, but you are absolutely right that when pressure comes from EU citizens to these countries, it will absolutely be framed as colonialism. This is why you have to work with us and to be in solidarity and to think about what the impact of EU legislation actually is.
The internet is global, right?
If I can offer one example, think about the EU's GDPR as a piece of legislation that is only applicable to this continent or to the EU. And its spillover effect, it has really set certain standards that even if they are European in application, they are global in scope. So when we are talking about, we are in a moment in time where a lot of governments are trying to figure out how to regulate tech companies. And so if the EU advances certain laws that are problematic, but maybe the problems can be challenged through due process or different mechanisms for people to seek redress, if those laws get copied and pasted in other countries, like in the MENA region, this is a big problem. So this is where I would say, you need to think really global. You need to think of other regions beyond the EU, because the EU can set global standards like it did when it comes to privacy and data protection.
Yeah. And our governments are working together, so we have to too. And I think that with that note, we'll close this panel. I see that we're at time. Thank you all so much. Sorry, Mohammed.
I just want to end on a positive note that all these discussion that we're talking about the MENA region, we do an event like Bread and Net. So there's like around 60 or 70 panels. This year it's going to be a festival in Beirut. So if you are interested in coming and joining this conversation, meeting the people behind these issues, please come and join.
What are the dates?
It's between November 15 and 17. So it will be great to see some of the Europeans coming and joining us and having this big network to make more pressure. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much as well. Wonderful questions.
So also from